Right, listen in, chaps. James is going to tell us all about Dan's place in the present day SF world. I assume that's science fiction.
Like that. No, yes. I think you've got.
Has that changed?
Okay. That's perfect.
No, there is a. If you read the actual thing,
I've got the actual thing.
No, the title is Beyond the Pale and Dare and the Eagle.
Doesn't say Beyond the Pale there.
Well,
yes, it does. No, it doesn't say Beyond the Pale there.
Take an up-to-date one.
Okay, right. Anyway, I'll hand over to the expert.
Thank you, Alistair. My name is James Bacon and I'm a train driver, but I'm actually very lucky because my father was a big fan of comics. So as a child, PC 49, Eagle Annuals and various other comics were to be found in the house. He also helped me with an addiction in comics, starting me off with more comics as a child, reading to me in digest format onto comics like Battle, 2000 AD and Eagle. So I come here today with a little bit of knowledge of other versions of Dan Dare. But before we look to what we might call the questionable adventures, as one may call them, I'd first like to have a look at another place that Dan Dare may have had an influence. And that is with an Irish language science fiction adventure known as Captain Sperling. Captain Sperling, translated into English, stands for Captain Sperling. Spare is Irish for sky. So the closest I can come to is skying captain. And that's the best we can do. 4 of these booklets were published in 1960 and 1961 by the Irish government Uifig an Taléir, which stands for Stationery Office. The man who wrote these books was Cathal O'Sander. Well, that's actually Charles, as he was known, but that is the Irish version of his name. And he wrote 4 of these Irish language booklets. They were not in chronological order, but I've put them into order so you get a quick picture for what they were like. The first one was called Captain Sperling Space Pilot, set in May 2000 during an atomic age. Terra, previously known as Earth, is now broken up into power blocks, the largest being Occidenta and Orienta. The United Nations have a headquarters on neutral ground in the City of Peace. Due to the usage of atomic power throughout the world, uranium is in short supply, and so there is a threat of war over the last supplies of uranium. A scientist, Professor O'Glar Khan, builds a spaceship to retrieve uranium from the moon and gets action man Captain Sperling to help him. After funding from the government, the professor, the captain, and Sperling's daughter, Deirdre, head off to uranium, along with an Orienta spy stowaway. While they are on their quest for uranium, they also find good rays. These are known as sugéithe in Irish, that take away anger and aggression and make people want to cooperate and live peacefully. Upon their return with both these good rays and the uranium, Ireland as a nation receives an honour. We then have Captain Sperling again, Captain Sperling to Mars, and Captain Sperling and the planet exploded. Captain Sperling again sees a voyage to Venus, and basically an English space pilot by the name of Sims has escaped and gone to Venus without permission, so Sperling is sent after him to bring him back. He finds, though, that Sims has married the Venusian queen Ina and is now planning on helping an invasion of Earth. Sperling and O'Glarcon are captured and sent to the marshlands. They subsequently escape, overthrow the captors, and end slavery, help with a transition to a more fair society, all in a matter of a few days. Meanwhile, Sims goes bonkers, based on a prophecy, and so flies into the sun. The whole matter is kept top secret. So you might just wonder whether there might have been a little bit of a hint of influence, and I think you'll all agree that there was. Next we come forward to 1978. Pat Mills was involved with the creation of a comic, 2000 AD. Now, in many ways, it has to be fairly said that this comic could rightfully challenge the seminal nature that Eagle possesses from 20 years previous. 2000 AD is still in print today, running weekly, and has been the source of many great comic book writers and artists who emanate from the UK and Ireland. In 1977, the comic debuted, and there on the cover in the corner, the only character was Dan Dare. This was a new Dan Dare, a very different Dan Dare. Written by Ken Armstrong and instigated by Pat Mills, who had been instrumental in the creation of the comic, Dare has been in suspended animation and is revived 200 years later into a very different and somewhat more 70s-styled science fictional world. 2000 AD was finding its way. The first issue did not even have Judge Dredd, who will become iconic and a continuous presence in the comic. Dan Dare was an attempt to create a science fictional space hero, and it was totally different from the original. But it should be noted, Mills liked the originals and said, "I'm hugely impressed by the original Venus adventure." The Mechon was the only continuity element that remained. The character of Dan Dare had little resemblance to the previous incarnations. Massimo Ballardinelli drew the first 23 issues. He had an incredible fantastical style, with Kevin Gelsnell and then Steve Moore writing. And although there was a harder in-your-face edge and it was interesting science fiction, the direction was changed again. Then written by Jerry Finley Day and Jack Adrian and illustrated by Dave Gibbons. According to Mills, Dan Dare is popular, about third or fourth in the popularity charts. This is at the time of its publication. Certainly not at the bottom in the comic where the readers liked all the stories. I don't recall any critical letters apart from things along the lines of, "My dad doesn't like it, but I do." And sometimes, "My dad likes it too." Lots of criticism from the press, however, but we don't care about annoying them. In fact, we quite like it. Mills said after he left the comic, "Tom Tully has taken it over and he's been given a power hand, and the character now has a superhero-ish costume. Neither of these moves will meet with my approval, but it's no longer my gig. I'm aware there are subsequent attempts to get it right, but of course the more you change writers, artists and realities, the more you can lose readers." And I believe that's how Dan Dare eventually died in 2000 AD. Dan Dare ended in Prague, or issue 126, a mere 2 years later. And you yourselves have heard today how the transition between artists and the original Eagle caused an upset. Here was a comic who just couldn't settle on any style or any artist. We then move forward again. And again, that same name, Pat Mills, returns. This was a man who created and made comics. That was what he did. He started them off and then he moved on. In 1982, Eagle was relaunched with Dan Dare, but again a new version. Pat Mills was again involved in setting up this comic. Dare was the great-great-great-grandson of the original, who thanks to some trickery was now an ex-Battle of Britain pilot. The initial artist Gary Embleton, who drew Dan to resemble the original exactly, was quickly replaced by Ian Kennedy, who gave the hero a younger look and blonder hair. The opening Dan Dare story was an epic lasting 18 months, written by Pat Mills and John Wagner. After this length of time, other writers came on board and the adventures were more team-focused. With Dare was now a Professor Pinkerton, rather like Professor Peabody, a female scientist, and a new descendant of Digby. In 1987, the strip took a violent twist, and taking the popularity of current films, it felt like a space opera. Dare was a hard man. He led a group of space commandos, and the weaponry was high-tech. Here was Dan Dare now. Then in 1989, the original characters from the 1950s were once again revived. Artist Keith Watson, who had been part of the Dan Dare team and provided some artwork on the initial run. But even so, the new Eagle came to an end in 1994. Pat Mills said, "Sometimes you should not mess around with a really very good original idea." And 2000 AD proved this. As a reader of 2000 AD, I can tell you that there have never been any reprints of the comics. And this year, 15 years after Rebellion took over and started churning out reprints of every story they could, they're now going to re-release the Dan Dare stories. Some people do enjoy them, some people love the artwork. But for me, they were poor. They were not to the standard I would have expected. But now we move to something else. We move forward to 1990. And Dare by Grant Morrison and Ryan Hughes. This was in a comic called Revolver. It was from the 2000 AD stable. They had produced comics called Crisis, and these were finding popularity among older teenagers. Dan Dare featured on the cover of Revolver in the first issue. This was drawn by Ryan Hughes, who had as much experience in comics as he had in design itself. This was a postmodernist view of the world that an older Dan lived in. The future was bleak. The comic, though, was clearly a satire of the politics of the early 1980s, and yet can also be seen today to have meaning and traction given our current society and how the societal vision of the 1950s, the care and welfare of all, have been horrendously eroded away. Dare is closeted away from the world, invalided but walking with a stick. The story starts brutally with the suicide of Professor Peabody. Dare is courted by the Prime Minister, Gloria Munday, of the Unity Party to help her continue on from her decade of power. There are strikes, food riots. She needs a re-election, and she needs a futuristic yet solid image as a poster boy, and she recruits Dan Dare. The dreadful vision of the future sees Starfleet privatised, the headquarters dilapidated, Treens racially abused, called goblins, living in ghettos dealing in drugs. The north and south divided is now a chasm. Queues for food last days. But when you look at this image, this is not drawn by somebody who had any disrespect for the original comic. This is drawn by people who cared about the original comic but needed to tell their story in 1990. The story I read in 1990 was perfect for me as a teenager, questioning authority, questioning what was going on around the world. This was not a comic for a young boy like I was 10 years beforehand. This is not a comic my father would have read to me. But this was the perfect comic for me at the time, as a 16-year-old trying to find my own way. Dare reckons that Peabody was murdered. She was working on a pie-in-the-sky project that would resolve the food issue. Digby reckons it too, but won't speak to Dare, angry with Dare over a war with the Treens. He admonishes Dare at one stage, saying, "You killed children," during the Treen revolt. Dan Dare, the child killer. This is the portrayal of a childhood hero for thousands of people, suddenly as a child killer. Why is it being portrayed like this? What is the message trying to come across? Dare joins Digby's resistance, and they work to uncover why Professor Peabody was killed, learning and doing so that Gloria Munday is in cahoots with the Mekon, and that a youth training program is actually turning humans into biomass. But the story gets more vile than one can imagine. The visceral and revolting nature of the Mekon plans are stomach-turning, and I'm not giving you the details. It is dreadful stuff. It is a dreadful story. It is exceptionally well told. It is exceptionally well drawn. It is purposely meant to make you feel upset and worry and reflect on the metaphorical message of the time. In many respects, Dan Dare fans may feel that this work is disrespectful. But in the story itself, Dare first questions himself whether at all he should be this poster boy. Then when he realises the full situation, he looks hard, finds the answers to the problem himself. This questioning and subversive viewpoint is fabulous, and ultimately, Dare makes an incredible sacrifice. The creator Morrison questioned what else was reflected in Dare's situation. Dare's despondency, the feeling of having been used and cast aside, exploitation, and whether parallels could be drawn with previous creators, previous fans. The comic itself came to an end with Dare, as I said, making a huge sacrifice. But then there's a whole other page of Frank Hampson's drawing desk and a quote from Hampson himself. Does this comic tarnish the good work? I do not believe so. This was a comic of its time. We must read it as such. You cannot read this comic hoping to get the nostalgia that you had when you were 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that I had at those ages when my father handed me those hardback Eagle annuals. This is not the comic for those times. This is a hard comic for those who want to look at a political metaphor. The next comic I want to mention, or magazine I should say, is Spaceship Away. We have already heard a little bit about that this morning, but within the community that is comic books, This has found a huge amount of respect. You do not need to buy Spaceship Away or to read Spaceship Away to know what it is. Comic fans of all ages talk about it at all the comic conventions. It is proof that people can bring back something and make their dreams come alive. They may not be reading it. Earlier it was questioned how many young people are reading this comic, and of course answers were given. But they definitely talk about this comic. This comic here is The Avengers. You may have heard of The Avengers. Currently it's doing quite well in movies and various things. But the character on the front page there is called Smasher. This is the new Smasher. As you can imagine, there are new characters quite frequently in comics. But what is the connection between this Marvel property and Dan Dare? Well, it was written by Jonathan Hickman, and there is a delicate and beautiful set of references. The main character, Smasher, here is a young astronomy student called Izzy, and she finds herself inducted to the Shi'ar Imperial Guard. Here we see, on your knees, Sub-Guardian, Isabel Dare. More becomes revealed as we see that her grandfather shows her a note. The note to her grandfather says, Dan, if you ever need anything, call me Steve. Steve Rogers, Captain America. So very gently and subtly we find a little reference to Dan Dare popped in, like an Easter egg as they say, into an issue of The Avengers. And now we come to the last comic that I have to talk about. This is Dan Dare by Gareth Ennis and Gary Erskine. Again, Dare is closeted away. Here he is, but that is not a real world where he lives. He is in exile on an asteroid. This is a virtual English world. Professor Peabody is now the Home Secretary. China and America have destroyed one another totally with nuclear weapons. Britain is in a very strong position. They lead the world, but their leader is corrupted. Their government is involved in sleaze. Once again, the Prime Minister goes out to seek Dare to elicit his help against the fight against the Mekong. A lovely reference to a Spitfire during this conversation, and Dare mentions his grandfather served in the Battle of Britain. Such subtle references going back to previous incarnations occur again and again. For instance, there is a red half moon drawn on a note which Dan Dare comes by in the Morrison and Hughes comic. And when they're searching in Professor Peabody's flat, he says, it's over here next to where the chlorophyll would be found. And again, where are these people putting these references if they do not appreciate where they've come from? Dare gets a command of the fleet, but in a moment of fortitude decides he must intervene to protect human and tree miners. He gets embroiled in a land battle with creatures of the Mekong's making. This allows Gareth Ennis to shine. We see Royal Marines in combat, and also see a march where we see Dan Dare explaining the history of his home planet to a young Mekong. Also explaining the history to new readers. Important elements of the story is the interaction between a Lieutenant Commander Christian, who questions her ability to command, and also her ability to make decisions. Dare appoints her as his XO, and also the story of Professor Peabody, where she reflects upon why Dan decided to exile himself. It appeared he had been involved with the National Front unbeknownst to himself. A Keeping Britain British organisation. This had tremendously affected him. Not that they would just even consider him as a figurehead, but that in the Britain he loved, they could exist. Gareth Ennis is a consummate war story writer. His knowledge of history and the workings and mechanics of war are inspired. His research is legendary in the business. Here he puts Dan Dare in a good old-fashioned war story. There is not a vast amount of the scientific. There is nowhere near the depth in any of these comics that you would find in an Eagle series. But it is enjoyable. It introduces Dan Dare to readers. But most of all, various things permeate through. Traditions, a healthy sense of humour, action. But most importantly, in these stories by Ennis and Morrison, we see a Dare who reflects upon his own morals, his own judgment, questioning himself, who then turns around and does the absolute right thing. These are dreadful stories in one sense because they're unpleasant, they're not nice. But we see Dare coming through that niceness, that modern or postmodern view, a gritty view, and succeeding and overcoming whatever troubles he faces. And in these situations, he faces human troubles more than he does the Mekong, realizing that where is the enemy? The enemy is amongst ourselves, hiding. For me, I would say to all of you here, try and overcome any initial dislike or distaste and look at these comics with an objective eye. See how they honour the character, how they share so many morals and virtues, and how they place the character into the modern world for older readers. And in that context, you may find some appreciation of them. Because the authors, the writers of these stories, the artists, greatly appreciated the originals. And here we see a frame from Morrison and Hughes's Dare, where they actually quote Frank Hampson. And within that, what are they saying? Here they are publishing a story in 1990 of Dan Dare, and yet they have the gumption to put this quote in, and a whole page full of the exact same image of the empty writing desk. Thank you very much.
Questions.
No, I hope not.
Somewhere I got the microphone. There it is. So if you have anything you want to ask, please wave your hand. Oh, that's sorry, I didn't see John.
Thank you, Alistair. Well, thanks for that insight into these later Dan Dares. I was aware of some of them, but I hadn't followed them in the level and degree you had, partly perhaps because I wasn't getting these publications. I suppose I could have gone and sought them out if I wanted to, but from what the images and the ideas they projected, I was prejudiced against them because they didn't seem to reflect the old Dan Dare. And also, you can get that kind of gritty material elsewhere. But thanks for your insight. I might actually now go and pursue some of these a bit further. And the other kind of hope, if it's the right word that your presentation has given, is that Dan Dare is a character who can be reinvented or revived from time to time to reflect new situations.
At the moment, in the comic industry, a number of characters have been reborn. By the time Dan Dare came out, Batman had been around 13 years and had many writers and creators working on them. Comics are, at their heart, always moving forward and changing and reinventing themselves. In the last 2 years, a comic which is a derivative of Flash Gordon has come out with the character known as Duke McQueen, because he couldn't say he was Flash Gordon, older and disbelieved. Nobody believes that he went off and saved another planet. Only his wife. And then she dies. His kids don't believe him. Flash Gordon is currently in publication. The Phantom is currently being published. There is hope, but of course I think the reality with Dan Dare is that that's an awful lot now about the property itself. There is no doubt that you could do something with Dan Dare right now if you wanted to, and it will probably be very popular. And in actual fact, the last 5 years possibly were one of the greatest windows for any British property to succeed. America has loved the Union Jack. So I think, though, yes, Dan Dare could be published. But yes, these comics, no, they're not meant to be for fans from the 1950s and 60s. Unless you want to read a comic that's going to actually say to you, it's not the same. It's taking the character, taking some of the goodness from that character, and doing what a story sometimes does, breaking the character down as low as they can go so they can come back up and say, yep, I have overcome that. And that's what it is for me.
Right. Any others?
No, good.
There we go.
Just about Just about the revolver, Dare. Just looking at that board, I mean, I'm a big fan of that revolver version, actually, because it's about betrayal, and it's about Dan's betrayed, and he's the symbol of the betrayal of England that Morrison obviously saw. And I think that's the scene of that picture. What's he saying? I'm giving up. I've been betrayed. And he was. The whole thing's about betrayal, and I think that's the key to that last image.
That's it, ready?
Yes. Good up. Okay.
There's one there. John's got one.
You talked about possible revivals, and it seems from what one of the previous speakers said that somebody or some company owns the name Dan Dare.
Ron would know best about
Right.
the property. I know that
Who actually owns it?
Ron would know that.
Dan Dare Corporation. It's not a UK company, though.
Right, the Dan Dare Corporation Limited brought all the rights they could get hold of Dan Dare for everything over a number of years, and they were behind the CGI series, which came out 10 years ago, a bit more than that. And what they did with that, apparently, because I talked to someone who originally worked on the series, they started doing it in England originally, and it was very true to the original Dan Dare then. Then, for some reason, they shifted to the States, and the States couldn't understand it, so they started changing everything. They couldn't understand Digsby's accent, so he became a Cockney. Professor Peabody was she was now an engineer. Hank, they made the biologist, and he just went around shooting everything up, killing all the animals, anything else he could find. They changed virtually everything of it, and they got such ridiculous storylines, they even landed on the sun at one stage.
So I think the answer there is that unfortunately it's caught up in that ownership issue where, it is a property that could be sold, but these guys will want to maximise their return of it.
They do.
It's how do they do that,
Well, this is it. I mean, we're paying a license for Spaceship Away.
Yeah.
We've just paid the one for this year and next year is £1,920 just for 6 issues. And that's just for a little fanzine. So I dread to think... we'd like to reprint some of the stories we've done, like the Hawk books, Old Eagle Size and everything. And when I made inquiries on it, there was so much they wanted out of it, it just wouldn't be economical for us to do it. Which is so sad.
Yes, well, we'll have to live with this one. Here's a question. Yeah.
Yes, I tried to reproduce a couple of frames from an annual which I have in a book which I had written. They wanted £150 each, so I said no, thank you.
There is a way around
65 years.
You know the way around that, don't you?
Well, my question is, when does the copyright run out? But
I wouldn't know copyright law, but I know from a reviewing point of view, if you take a photograph of yourself holding and we're looking at a comic, and then you publish that, it's transformed that image, so the actual painting or image is not any longer copyright. I wanted to get a picture of an Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol drew Superman. He did a Batman logo, and he did lots of other stuff before he became famous for the Campbell's tins. And the only way I could get the image was to actually sort of stand in front of a print and go like that, and then have somebody take the photograph here. And it's really tough. Like, you're not, just weren't allowed to use it. Right? And again, we were a free fanzine going out to people, so it's a bit crazy. But I don't know. The copyright of these things is important to the people who own them. And it's important for, Dan Dare was published by Virgin Comics, now it's published by IDW, but the ownership of these things is important, and obviously sometimes the ownership is crucial to its longevity as well. Okay.
Well, if I put my Arthur C. Clarke Foundation hat on, we've got problems with copyright with Arthur C. Clarke and his signature, which we're trying to solve at the moment. So,
fantastic.
All sorts of problems. Right, anyone else? I think we're going to have to thank you very much for coming along.